Our scripture reading this morning comes from the book of Esther. Bulletins were sent out by couriers to all the king's provinces with orders to massacre, kill, and eliminate all the Jews. The order was also posted in the palace complex of Susa. The king and Haman sat back and had a drink while the city of Susa reeled from the news. When Mordecai learned what had been done, he ripped his clothes to shreds and put on sackcloth and ashes. Then he went out into the streets of the city, crying out loud in bitter cries. There was loud lament among the Jews, fasting, weeping, wailing, and most of them stretched out on sackcloth and ashes. Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her. The queen was stunned. She sent fresh clothes to Mordecai so he could take off his sackcloth, but he wouldn't accept them. Esther called for Hathach, one of the royal eunuchs whom the king had assigned to wait on her, and told him to go to Mordecai and get the full story of what was happening. Mordecai told Hathach everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to deposit in the royal bank to finance the massacre of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the bulletin that had been posted in Susa, ordering the massacre, so he could show it to Esther when he reported back with instructions to go to the king and intercede and plead with him for her people. Hathach came back and told Esther everything Mordecai had said. Esther talked it over with Hathach and then sent him back to Mordecai with this message. Everyone who works for the king here, and even the people out in the provinces, know that there is a single fate for every man or woman who approaches the king without being invited: death. The one exception is if the king extends his gold scepter, then he or she may live. And it's been 30 days now since I have been invited to come to the king. When Hathach told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai sent her this message: Don't think that just because you live in the king's house, you're the one Jew who will get out of this alive. If you persist in staying silent at a time like this, help and deliverance will arrive for the Jews from someplace else, but you and your family will be wiped out. Who knows? Maybe you were made queen for just such a time as this. Esther sent back her answer to Mordecai. Go and get all the Jews living in Susa together. Fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, either day or night. I and my maids will fast with you. If you will do this, I'll go to the king, even though it's forbidden. If I die, I die. Mordecai left and carried out Esther's instructions. Holy wisdom, holy word. Thanks be to God.
Hello, friends. Today we continue our sermon series on the stories of the prophets. The Hebrew prophets in our biblical witness are God's messengers, and they serve as God's voice to interrupt unjust systems. They serve as God's calling. They serve as encouragers and inspirers for God's people to return to God or to keep on the path of God's good work by bringing about a more just and loving and peaceful world. And in our series so far, Adam has led us in exploring the stories of Deborah, Jeremiah, Amos, and Hosea. And today we explore the story of Esther, paying attention to how the Spirit of God is present, active, and also to what invitation God may be extending us through Esther's story. I invite you to pray with me. Holy mystery, may the words of my mouth and the meditations in each of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, to help us modern-day readers understand the book of Esther a little more, I offer a little background. This book was written in the 4th century BCE as a work of historical fiction, with one primary purpose being to give encouragement to the Jewish people who were living in exile in the Persian Empire at that time. lifting up the challenge of living faithful lives in a foreign and unfaithful world, and conveying that through their powerlessness under Persian rule, that they can have encouragement through the life and story of Esther. The book of Esther recounts the escape of the Jewish community, as we heard a portion of the story just now, from attempted genocide, and to provide the origin story of the Jewish festival of Purim, or Purim, which celebrates that escape, which the Jews celebrate every year in the springtime. And Purim is like a carnival-type festival atmosphere where participants dressed up in costumes, they drink and make merry, they read the scroll of Esther, and when they hear the names of the evil anti-Semite Haman, whom we will meet in the story, the reader is drowned out with booing and hissing and noisemakers. And when the names of the heroes of the story are uttered, Esther and her uncle Mordecai, the crowds loudly cheer. As we hear the story of Esther, we'll encounter irony, extreme and ridiculous exaggeration, and even humor. And this is the author's intent, to help make a point, to help the audience then and us today notice the contrast of the underlying seriousness of this story. The story begins by telling us that the Persian king ruling at this time, whose name was Ahasuerus, that he was king over basically everything, from India to Ethiopia, all the provinces in between, and as well as over vast armies. And he was something of a buffoon as a king. He was so full of himself, not very bright. He blew like a reed in the wind by others' plans and opinions. And when we meet him, he's hosting a feast for all the leaders in his kingdom. All the fancy people were there. And the king was showing off his awesome riches, his beautiful treasures, all to show how great he was. And we're told this party lasted for 6 months. And after that, he began another feast for 7 straight days for everyone else, for both the important people, the unimportant people. Everyone within the royal town of Susa was invited. Everyone drank from gold goblets, and not one goblet matched another. They could have as much wine as they could stomach, open bar with no limits. That was the king's orders. And after 7 days, Ahasuerus, in higher than high drunken spirits, gave an order that begins to set the comedy tragedy of the story of Esther in motion. We will meet 2 queens, Queen Vashti, followed by Queen Esther. Both refused to let men and their schemes degrade and dehumanize women, as in the case of Vashti, or to degrade, dehumanize, and destroy an entire group, the Jewish people, as in the case of Queen Esther. Well, back to the king. He orders his attendants to fetch his wife, Queen Vashti, to come and parade before everyone who was there, wearing the royal crown. She was gorgeous, we're told, and the king wanted to show her off. And some biblical scholars suggest that the king's order was that she come wearing only the crown, and otherwise come naked. Well, Queen Vashti flat out refused to be so degraded. She refused to come. The king was furious, to say the least. Her queenship was stripped and she was barred from the palace, and the king set out to replace her with someone better. He began his search among the young unmarried women throughout his entire kingdom for Vashti's replacement, and among those was Esther. Esther could not have been more powerless in that day and time. She was an orphan, a female, a Jew living under foreign rule. And she was beautiful in the king's eyes and won his favor, and he chose Esther to be the next queen. Up to this point, she has hidden her Jewish identity. Next in the story, we meet Haman, the king's viceroy or prime minister, promoted to this highest rank by the king himself. And by order of the king, all the other royal workers at the king's gate were to kneel and bow down to Haman when they passed him by, or when he passed by. But one man named Mordecai refused. This is an important note. Mordecai was Queen Esther's uncle, having taken Esther into his home when she was a young orphan to raise her like his own daughter. Haman's underlings noticed that Mordecai refused to kneel and bow to Haman, and they questioned him day after day, but he paid no attention, except he did tell those royal workers that he was a Jew. When Haman himself witnessed Mordecai's refusal to pay him homage, he was outraged and immediately made plans to kill Mordecai. But he didn't stop there. He decided he better wipe out the entire Jewish people living under the Persian Empire. Haman fled to the king with his plans for genocide, justifying his case by othering the Jewish people. That is, presenting them as less than, as an aberration, a threat to both his and the king's power, privilege, control, security. That is to say, he presented the Jews as a big threat, and that only extermination of them would suffice. Haman told it to the king in this way: there's a certain group of people who exist in pockets among the other peoples throughout your kingdom. Their laws are different from everyone else. They refuse to obey the king's laws. Notice how Haman easily extends this one man Mordecai's act of resistance to the entire Jewish people. They all must be this way, he contends. Haman said to the king, there's no good reason for the king to put up with them any longer. If the king wishes, write an order to be sent to destroy them, and I'll even fund it myself. I'll add 75 pounds of silver to your royal bank account. Well, the king doesn't bat an eye. He loved the idea of the money, of course, and he told Haman, do as you like. This is where the passage that Whitney read for us picks up. The royal order for the massacre of the Jews of every age, every gender, became law immediately and was posted throughout the kingdom. And when it was posted in the royal city of Susa, we're told the whole city was reeling from this news, while Haman and the king sat down and had a cocktail. The irony points out the extreme of this horror for the oppressed, those deemed different by their oppressor. And the way was paved for this othering of an entire people by another. We know this is not a new human reality. History reveals this to us. It began with the beginning of time. Recently, friends here at Knox, along with our friends at Third Presbyterian Church, and I experienced a civil rights trail journey to the U.S. South, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. We visited historical sites of our history with slavery and the civil rights movement, and we experienced how the effects of our tragic history live on, how we have yet to experience equal civil rights here in the U.S., how the movement for the honoring the dignity and worth of every human, regardless of skin color, national origins, gender or sexual identity, socioeconomic status, religion, or any other identifier, must continue and is continuing. Through museum after museum and exhibit after exhibit, film footage, pictures, personal testimony, story after story we experienced of immense violence of white people against black people during the time of slavery and after emancipation when it seemed to even escalate. It was murderous violence leading to an age of lynchings in all forms. It became commonplace. At a point in our U.S. history, the United States officially othered black people by declaring them 3/5 human. In this way, we could justify denying them constitutional rights, which were created for humans. This story for me continues to ask me to ask myself, how do we humans have this capacity to commit such atrocities toward another fellow human? And what comes to me from my own experience is a three-part journey. I think we find the first part of this journey in the Torah, the law of our Hebrew Bible, where the 10 Commandments are. Those 10 laws that God gave to Moses to give to the people, our faith ancestors. And the very first commandment we recall, you shall have no other gods before me. In other words, God says, put your trust in me. Put me first in your life, for I alone am trustworthy, constant, and faithful love. And it seems to me if we lose sight of this, let me back up. If we didn't have this command, if we followed this command, I don't think we would need the rest of the 9, which tell us don't lie, don't slander, don't degrade, don't kill, always honor. Keep the Sabbath, which God gives us to restore our souls for our journey. It all begins with that first commandment. But if we lose sight of that and we do put reliance for our welfare on something other than a loving, benevolent, higher power, which is the path that Jesus invites us to, we as humans are going to look for security in the things of the world, very naturally, the things we can see and touch and feel, money, prestige, power, all the things that are fleeting, but we really don't believe they're fleeting. And when our security housed in the things of the world is threatened, this makes way for the third part of this path to our capacity to commit such harm toward another. If we experience a threat to our social, physical, emotional security, we're going to ask the question, who caused this? What caused this? What person or persons are responsible for this insecurity I feel? And we're apt to create or buy into someone's story that a certain person or people are the reason for our threat. Those people over there, we're going to talk in them, those versus we, us. And then it's easy to other those people, to find ways to deem them as different or somehow bad, less than, not worthy, or even dangerous. Which is to say, we must strip the truth of their inherent divine dignity, their being a fellow sibling with us in God's family. They're being created in the very image of our divine and loving God. It's much easier to hate, harm, destroy someone we don't believe is like us or as deserving of God's grace as we are. And we humans have been doing this to one another forever, in wartime and beyond, in neighborhoods. From Haman's plot here in ancient Persia, the fate of the Armenians in the early 20th century, the Nazi Holocaust, of course, are obvious examples. And we see the othering in our nation, in our immigration system, where the majority of those being detained, arrested, or deported are persons of color, even though they may not make up the majority of immigrants. Well, back to our story. When Mordecai learns of Haman's murderous plot, rubber-stamped by the king, he's devastated. He's outraged. He sends a message to his niece, Queen Esther, begging her to plead with the king for the sake of her people. Well, Esther also is devastated by the news. She's terrified by Mordecai's request. She sends word to Mordecai of the reality that it doesn't matter if you're a queen or a nobody, male or female, anyone who comes into the king's presence without being invited is to be put to death. Just another outlandish law of the king. Well, Mordecai doesn't delay in replying. Don't think that you, Esther, a fellow Jew, will escape with your life just because you're queen. the king and his court are not sane and not rational, you'll die along with us. If you don't speak up, help will come from another place. I believe that. But could it be, Queen Esther, that you were made queen for such a time as this? Esther's cut to the heart. And she orders him and all the Jews to fast along with her in her court for 3 days, fasting being a Jewish religious practice intending to move God. Mordecai agrees and carries out her decree. After those days, Esther approaches the king uninvited. And the story is longer, but the shorter take is that the king does not refuse her, does not order her death. He's so taken by his affection of her. And he asks her, "What do you want? I'll give it all to you, even half of my kingdom." Well, before answering, Esther invites the king and his right-hand man Haman to a banquet. And he asked her again, "What do you want?" And she said, "Just wait." And then invites them both to a second banquet. And then when the king is sufficiently jolly and ego-stuffed by all the attention, Queen Esther makes her request, saying, "If this pleases the king, give me my life and the life of my people. For I and my people have been sold to be wiped out, utterly destroyed. If this plan was just for our damage, I would keep silent. But you and your kingdom will be greatly damaged as well." The wisdom of Esther is that if there is destruction of human life anywhere, it destroys human life everywhere, for the living as well as those destroyed. The king asked her, "Who is behind this? Where is he? Who would dare such a thing?" Esther replies, "A man who hates, an enemy, the wicked Haman." Haman, hearing this, was terrified. The king was enraged and ordered Haman to be slain. In ironies of ironies in this story, the king ordered that Haman be killed on a stake, a ridiculously high 75-foot stake that Haman had constructed, on which he planned to kill Mordecai. Esther, Mordecai, and all the Jewish people were saved. And again, the festival of Purim has celebrated this salvation every year to this day. I try to imagine Esther being asked by her uncle to intervene. I wonder if she said, "Why me? How me? Really me?" And perhaps moved by the Spirit of God, she came to ask, "Why not me?" And perhaps it is for such a time as this, she realized that she was brought into this royal court to help her people. So Esther shows the extent we humans can go to help one another. Contrary to the extent Haman demonstrates for harm, Esther risks her own life to help save thousands, or maybe more, of the lives of others. What about you? What about me? What about us today? Have we been asked to do something that causes us to pause or to be afraid, even if it would be helpful to one or many? Do we ever say to ourselves, "Why me?" Just yesterday, I was at a presbytery event as we explored the movement originating in East Westwood and Third Presbyterian Church, the Peace, Love, and Hope lifestyle. And we were learning about ways to counter gun violence and other forms of violence in our communities. And I was speaking to a woman who is the vice moderator of the whole presbytery, the whole region here of our several Presbyterian churches. She's an ordained elder in her church. And when the executive presbyter said, "Kathy, I think we want to nominate you to be the vice moderator and then the moderator of this presbytery." And Kathy looked around and thought about all the intelligent gifted, experienced pastors and elders around her and said, "Why me?" And the inviter literally said, "Why not you?" And then Kathy remembered, as a cancer survivor some years ago, she had a prayer with God where she said, "God, I will say yes to anything you call me to." In other words, she said, "I will trust that if you call me, you will equip me." And in that moment, she remembered that prayer. And instead of saying, "Why me?" she said, "You're right, why not me?" And now she's in leadership of our presbytery. I have a friend another survivor of a very deadly disease. And now in his life, he's seeking to volunteer in a cancer recovery center to help others on the journey, to offer them his experience and a hopeful presence for them. Those of us in the 12-step program of recovery from addiction learn this very vital thing as well. We're taught that we are uniquely situated to help another who suffers with the same affliction. The disease having been arrested in us just one day at a time, we have experience, we have strength, we have hope to help those others who understand the malady in ways that someone who has never had it just can't. Why not you? Why not me? I think about our friends through Found House, our homeless siblings, as Matt described. Why not us, called as the body of Christ to offer the radical hospitality of Christ to one and all, male or female, regardless of background or age? This is our calling. I'd like to say the story of Esther ends with everyone lived happily ever after. But it doesn't for everyone. Esther and Mordecai do rise to royal power and influence, and the king grants them permission for them and the Jewish people to defend themselves against their enemies going forward. And they do, because the threats continue, and thousands upon thousands die because of that. Showing us that still, when we put our trust, our faith, when we let go of the first commandment and put our security in something of this world and not put God first, we're still going to be insecure. We're going to be afraid of anything that might threaten our very life, our livelihood, those we love, our reputation, our power and control. So we have work to do. The path of Christ shows us the way. When he was asked, "Teacher, which of the commandments is the greatest?" Knowingly, Jesus said, "The first is this, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself." And then he said, "This is the sum of all the law and all the prophets." It's not an easy path. It's very simple, though. Love. Friends, if we're paying attention, we too will be asked, until we enter our next life, why not you? Perhaps it is for such a time as this that you are living, you are doing this kind of work, you are in fellowship with these people, you've encountered this person on the street who is terrified and just needs a word of care or a smile. It could be a simple thing or a big thing. But just for this such time, we are called. And friends, I invite us to pay attention today and prepare to be surprised, remembering that God has already equipped us for the journey as God equipped Esther and Mordecai and Vashti before them, and all the saints who have gone before us, who are now helping us on our journey. May we know and follow and trust Christ with our whole lives. We can stake our life on him. In the name of God, our Creator, our Redeemer, and our Sustainer. Amen.